Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Leslie McCara. I'm the Director of the Edinburgh Futures Institute and Assistant Principal for Community Relations at the University. So on behalf of all of my colleagues at Edinburgh, can I offer you all a very warm welcome to this second in the 2021 Gifford Lecture Series in the magnificent Playfair Library Hall. So welcome on a rather miserable evening, not typical Edinburgh weather, I have to say. So welcome, and a particular welcome to David's family who are on the front row there. So welcome to Edinburgh from me. So, as many of you will know, the Gifford Lectures were inaugurated in 1888, around 100 years after the foundation stone for Old College was laid. The series was established under the will of Adam Lord Gifford, a senator of the College of Justice, and he did this to promote and diffuse the study of natural theology in the widest sense of the term, and with an aim that the lectures should be both scholarly but also suitable for a wider public audience, a general audience, so scholarly and general. Since its inception, the series has been graced by many, many eminent scholars. The history of them is a fantastic who's who's, but from an extremely diverse range of disciplinary backgrounds, including people such as Iris Murdoch, Hannah Arendt, and Niels Bohr. And the series, I think, is a brilliant demonstration of one of the critical functions of a university, to be a place of convocation and debate, bringing expert knowledge and illumination to the world's most complex problems, complex philosophical, scientific and social problems. And in that spirit, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor David Hempton. He's Senior Professor and Dean of the Divinity School at the University of Harvard, and he's going to continue his Gifford series on the theme of networks, nodes and nuclei in the history of Christianity from 1500 to 2020. So it's this very large scope, this big narrative arc through history. And this evening we're going to hear the second of his 6 lectures entitled Religious Networks in the Reformation Era. Please note that the lecture and questions this evening are being recorded, and the video will shortly be available on the University's Gifford Lectures web pages and blog. So I now have very great pleasure in inviting Professor David Hempton to give his second Gifford lecture. Welcome, David, and thank you.
Thanks very much, and welcome back. Those of you who were here last night, and welcome for the first time if you missed last evening. So last evening I spent a little bit of time just talking about the theoretical background to this, trying to introduce the terms of networks, nuclei and nodes, and give some concrete examples of what they might look like in a kind of global picture. I also mentioned last night a sporting event of enormous significance when I was at St Andrews and defeated the Edinburgh University hockey team in the final of the Scottish Universities Championship. This is a mega event in world history, which I'll be referring to every evening. So now on to religious networks in the Reformation era. 2 networks transformed the early modern world. The first was the Iberian network of discoverers and conquerors that helped usher in an age of European world domination. The second was facilitated by a new technology, printing, which helped to unleash the huge religious and political disruption we know as the Reformation, as well as to pave the way for the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and much else that was antithetical to the Reformation's original intent. The stakes could not be higher. What Niall Ferguson calls a religious virus that came to be known as Protestantism disrupted an ancient ecclesiastical hierarchy, fractured into many pieces Europe's Catholic Christianity, and ushered in a long era of violent conflict that left very few places unaffected. Brad Gregory's unintended Reformation controversially takes the argument even further by suggesting that the Reformation disrupted Latin Christianity's integrated worldview, within which the overwhelming majority of Europeans lived and made sense of their lives. Over the long run, so the argument goes, this integrated religious worldview was unintentionally replaced by a fragmented civilization comprised of pluralism, capitalism, consumerism, and secularism. This almost dispensational periodization of both a centuries-old integrated view of medieval society and of the impact of Protestant novelty, I think underestimates the perpetual processes of negotiation between local reform efforts and re-establishment within the church, the universities, and the monasteries. The change wasn't as dramatic, I think, as he indicates. At least some of the rhetoric around medieval unity and integration was actually propaganda that arose in concert with rising stakes in the globalizing context of power struggles in the later 15th and early 16th centuries. The key question is not so much how new ideas disrupted a supposedly monochrome medieval consensus, but how did reformed ideas interact with other macroscopic changes to reshape the texture of European life on so many levels? Put another way, then, how did an event of such huge and lasting consequence, which we call the Protestant Reformation, emerge from a small and unlikely event in a relatively unimportant town in northeastern Germany in 1517? And how does the framework of this lecture series, namely networks, nodes, and nuclei, amplify our understanding of what happened and how it happened? The nucleus in this story, at least to begin with, is Martin Luther himself and the revolutionary ideas he successfully propagated, especially the linked ideas of the freedom of the Christian and justification by faith alone. The nodes and the networks are primarily the connections between Wittenberg and the other great centers of print publication and dissemination in Nuremberg, Augsburg, Basel, Strasbourg, and other cities in Imperial Germany. Although print is what holds this story together and generates much of the narrative energy, it is important to state some caveats at the start which don't show up in Ferguson's analysis. The first is that the potential of print, including its emphasis on the Bible as the Word of God, had already been harnessed by Erasmian humanists for propagandist and educational purposes before the printing press helped the dissemination of Protestantism in Germany. Second, in many parts of Europe, and even in Germany itself, print often took a backseat to other forms of dissemination, principally through oral transmission, via the personal networks created by mobile merchants, humanist scholars, or itinerant students, through preaching campaigns, or through the informal transfer of news and rumor prior to appearing in print. Oral communication is not only crucial for a full understanding of how networks functioned in early modern Europe, especially given the low literacy rates, but also oral means of transmission inevitably changed the content of the communication. What was spoken was not always the same as what was heard. In addition, Reformation ideas were promulgated by many other forms of network communication, including hymns, songs, woodcut illustrations, broadsheets, catechisms, ditties, and stories. But even with these caveats in place, the sheer scale of print production and dissemination in Luther's Germany is quite remarkable, and Luther was unmistakably at the center of it. In his fine account of how Brand Luther came to have such extensive influence, Andrew Pettigrew begins with Luther himself, who emerged as a writer of extraordinary power and fluency, a natural stylist in a genre that not to that point particularly valued those skills. In the process, Luther created what was essentially a new form of theological writing, lucid, accessible, and above all short, not always like academic writing. Luther, a little-known Augustinian friar in a minor university town, made his breakthrough into wider public consciousness with the publication of his Sermon on Indulgences and Grace, which took on the medieval church's understanding of the sacrament of penance and indulgences. The sermon made quite a splash and was followed up by more vernacular pamphlets of mostly devotional and pastoral nature. Meanwhile, an even more controversial Latinate story was brewing through Luther's public disputations and more subversive criticism of the papacy and clerical elites, in which Luther's characteristic emphases on sola scriptura and the priesthood of all believers began to emerge more clearly. By the summer and winter of 1520, Luther's vernacular readers were aware that big controversial issues were at stake, and the conservative Catholic publicists who tried to refute Luther inexorably made the situation worse by making a point of it. Catholic opposition and censorship proved to be ineffectual instruments of control, especially in cities and universities where emerging elites and ideas were hard to suppress. As the controversy deepened, there were important changes to the presentation and distribution of Lutheran propaganda that substantially increased the volume and impact of Luther's writings. The printing operation in Wittenberg was professionalized by Melchior Lotter Jr. and Lucas Cranach's woodcuts, not only transformed the appearance and aesthetics of the Wittenberg publications, but helped transform the landscape of printing throughout Europe. This is something that was referred to last night by Professor J. Brown, that central to my story about networks, nodes, and nuclei and transmission, there's a kind of technological story underpinning it when major technological changes facilitate, promote, speed up transmission along the networks we've talked about. In business parlance, Luther was now a brand leader and an innovator, and he benefited from the increased competitiveness and lucrativeness of the printing industry. The more competitive the printing trade became in any given city, the more likely it was to turn Protestant. The bare figures are remarkable. Between 1517 and 1525, there was more than a 40-fold increase in the number of printed pamphlets. And by 1546, the presses of the German-speaking land produced over 6 million vernacular treatises supporting or opposing the Reformation, one for every 2 people in the empire. Luther's writings, 80% of which were in German, far exceeded those of anyone else. According to pedigree, over the course of the 16th century, German printers produced over 5,000 editions of Luther's works, and another 3,000 if one includes projects he was instrumental in propagating, including the hugely influential Luther Bible. There's no question, therefore, that circulating print through a network of German printing presses in imperial cities, with Wittenberg as the unlikely center, played a crucial role in distributing the ideas and content of the early German Reformation. But if print was essential for Brand Luther was also vital for the expansion of the German printing industry. After Luther, print and public communication would never be the same again. And this is an important point, I think, in my lectures, where there are these kind of jump overs between religious networks and important social and economic changes that are going on in the wider culture. And the two together produce a synergy that one or the other could not do by themselves. The economics of printing forced the creation of nexuses or printing centers because it was far cheaper to reprint works not protected by copyright than to ship large numbers of copies overland. This is a really important point, actually. It's more the reprinting that drove the sheer volume of this, really because dragging copies overland was so difficult to do. Luther's own dominance of the press depended not so much on the number of his works as on the frequency of reprints. Hence, Luther's religious ideas helped urban elites reconceive and justify their economic practices, not only in the printing trades, but in the wider economic order of towns and cities in the German Empire. And here, as I'm not primarily a scholar of the Reformation, that I'd really like to know more about the relationship between printing trades and civic elites in other aspects of urban governance and in other urban industries. Another important dimension to the dissemination of Lutheran ideas, bringing together print and oral culture, was the proliferation of hymnals and song sheets. According to one careful estimate, there were more than 2 million hymnals, song sheets, and other hymn-related materials circulating in 16th century Germany. And the overwhelming preponderance of all hymn printing was Lutheran. The well-known printing centers of Nuremberg, Leipzig, Strasbourg, and Wittenberg accounted for over half the production, But hymn printing was also widely disseminated across almost 50 other German towns. Luther was himself a prolific author of hymns and melodies, but the Lutheran laity, including women, also played an important part. Hymns were not only used in public expressions of Lutheran worship, but also in homes, workplaces, and other informal arenas. So hymns, as with later Methodist hymnody and Pentecostal songs, and more recently in the worldwide distribution of Hillsong praise songs coming out of Australia, were, in this case, effective ways of spreading Reformation theological ideas, both doctrinal and more practically pietistic and accessible forms. So this is another theme, I think, in the networks that I'm looking at. In Mark Noll's book titled, We Are What We Sing, just the enormous impact of hymns as little containers of theological ideas and little expressions of communal togetherness, not just in public worship spaces, but in private domestic spaces as well. The extent to which Lutheran theological ideas and confessional loyalties percolated down from elites to the broader population was largely owing to the successful distribution and singing of Lutheran hymns, especially in the homes of the laity. The format, size, structure, and content of Lutheran hymnals make clear that they were primarily printed not for the professional market, but rather for private lay use. The Lutheran hymnal of the 16th century was foremost and most typically not a church book, but a household book, and contributed more than other forms of Lutheran print to a devotional reformation as well as to a theological one. Understanding the importance of print to the Lutheran Reformation is a necessary but insufficient part of the explanation of how and why the Reformation gained strength in many different forms in many different national contexts. This takes us back to the first lecture, in which it was stated that for religious networks to be successful, they need to be synergistically connected to other structural change from which they benefit, but do not necessarily create. As Bob Scribner noted many years ago, there is no doubting the specifically national characteristics of the Reformation as it took root in different places over time, but he was also able to identify some more or less consistent themes. They included the preparatory and mediating role of continental humanism, the availability of a vernacular Bible, the importance of urban elites, especially the politically organized estates, and the corresponding weakness of the Reformation in traditional rural areas, and the overwhelming significance of the religious allegiances and policies of monarchs and rulers. So his conclusion was that for the Reformation to have an enduring existence anywhere, it had to become deeply embedded in national identities and contexts, so that, for example, for the sake of its durability and impact, the Reformation in England had to become the English Reformation. The same was true for most other countries. So far, our treatment of Reformation networks has concentrated on print and the Lutheran Reformation. But within a generation, Calvinism superseded Lutheranism as the most dynamic and widely disseminated form of Protestantism. By the second half of the 16th century, Reformed churches were firmly rooted in France, Scotland, here in Scotland, England, the Netherlands, Hungary, and Poland, Lithuania. In the 17th century, the colonizing efforts of the emerging Dutch and English empires carried Reformed Protestantism to North America and South Africa. How did this happen? What were the nuclei, nodes, and networks of the early European Reformed tradition? This story goes back to Zwingli in Zurich, and even more directly to his successor, Heinrich Bullinger, who built up an extensive network of correspondence and published many influential works. But the most important of the early Reformed leaders was, of course, Bullinger's contemporary, John Calvin. His monumental Institutes of the Christian Religion, first published in 1536, contains the nucleus of Reformed theology, and his base in Geneva became the most important node of the international Reformed network. In both word and ecclesiastical practice, Calvin's theology was an intellectually compelling attempt to reconcile Christian freedom with godly order by way of the characteristic Calvinistic emphases on divine sovereignty, providence, predestination, and church discipline. The last of these represents perhaps Calvin's most famous legacy, for here was the blueprint in its general structural outline for the most widespread form of ecclesiastical order in the Protestant world. Calvin drew up a practical guide for the ordering of the church in Geneva, which was spelt out in his ecclesiastical ordinances. This prototype of the presbyterial synodal system was not followed in exact detail throughout the Reformed world, but its underlying principles for the exercise of church governance and discipline marked out all the Reformed churches of the 16th century. Calvin's writings and Calvin's Geneva were the most important nuclei and nodes of the Reformed tradition, but they weren't the only ones. Pierre Viret in Lausanne, Guillaume Farel in Neuchâtel, John Alasco in Emden, and others within the Swiss Confederation and affiliated territories contributed to a growing Reformed matrix of scholars and preachers, churches and communities. This network was not without its heated disagreements and occasional ruptures, but it was held together by a broad allegiance to Reformed theological principles, the influence of hegemonic urban churches, periodic attempts to construct consensus, as in the Second Helvetic Confession and other confessions, and perhaps most important of all, by a vigorous anti-Catholicism that was much less tolerant of any accommodation to Catholic rituals than the Lutheran wing of the Reformation. The network was also sustained by a peripatetic band of Reformed scholars and preachers of no fixed abode, sheltering from the cold winds of persecution in their respective homelands, and by self-conscious attempts to grow the network, as in the more than 220 pastors dispatched mostly from Geneva to oversee the organization of worship in the Piedmont and France in the decade after 1554. By the end of the 16th century, the international Reformed networks of churches, notwithstanding the intense dynastic and political pressures to which they were often subjected, displayed a remarkable fellowship and solidarity. They shared personnel, Eucharistic fellowship, and crucial elements of political outlook. They consulted with one another on issues of doctrine, and they offered one another their prayers and financial solidarity in time of need. Examples include the Harmony of Confessions, published in 1581, drawing together the articles of 11 different Reformed confessions in response to the Lutheran formula of concord, and the collections that were raised for mutual support in times of affliction, as when the Duke of Savoy mounted a campaign to retake Geneva in 1589. But plenty of raw human mobility also wove the disparate Reformed churches into a larger international community. For wherever one looks in the histories of the early Reformed tradition, the more examples there are of remarkable human travels along the arteries of the Reformed networks of churches, universities, and cities. Jean Taffin was born in Tournai, trained for the ministry in Antwerp, Strasbourg, and Geneva, served churches in Aachen, Metz, and then back to Antwerp, and later fetched up in Heidelberg, Haarlem, and Amsterdam. The Reformed in Transylvania sent their aspirant clergy to study in France, Germany, England, and the Dutch Republic. Albert Molnar studied at Wittenberg, Heidelberg, and Strasbourg before spending time in the German universities of Herborn, Altdorf, and Marburg, while conducting an extensive correspondence with French and Flemish scholars. John Knox spent 12 years of his life almost continuously on the move, from Scotland to England, France, Geneva, Frankfurt, Dieppe, and then back to Scotland again. Knox's career, according to Alec Reary, exemplifies in unusually stark terms the strengths and weaknesses of early Reformed networks, and perhaps of networks in general. He writes, "They can do some things superbly well," these are networks. "They can spread ideas, build contacts, shelter refugees, defend and rally those scattered and discouraged by persecution, support preachers, spread propaganda, establish orthodoxies, and discipline dissenters in their ranks. What they and their human components can't easily do is engage in hard politics, make and effect diplomatic calculations, and effect change from above, except in very rare cases when the network becomes integrated into are co-opted by the instruments of power. So this is one of the themes I'm developing through the lectures, that the networks I'm most interested in are the ones that pop up from below or from outside established authorities, hierarchies, nation states, and so on. And this gives them enormous populist energy and ability to move across borders and frontiers. It becomes much more difficult for them to gain control over structures of power and influence from above rather than from below. So the network sustained by Protestants in the Reformation era consisted of overlapping connections based on print, correspondence circles, schools and universities, and refuges from overt opposition and persecution. Because they were based primarily on intellectual commitments and spiritual priorities, they could be sustained by ties of loyalty and solidarity, even when the structures of hierarchies and power operated against them. The Reformed networks in France, Puritan migrations across the Atlantic, and many other examples of Protestant survival in unfriendly local contexts show that networks can survive and even thrive without official support. So these networks are extremely important. No Harvard without Reformed networks just wouldn't have existed. No salary for me, no Gifford lectures. And also a very different Edinburgh University with the first provost, Robert Rollock, himself plugged into Reformed networks, and his own biblical scholarship got published and reprinted in major Calvinist centers in Europe. So these networks mattered, not least in the two universities represented here this evening. This foray into the European Reformations through the networks that helped the spread of innovative ideas, what Torsten Hagerstrand has called innovation diffusion as a spatial process. So my analysis is concentrated mostly on the Lutheran and Reformed Reformations so far. But there are also myriads of networks spawned by the more radical Reformation traditions, such as the Anabaptists and their successors. Indeed, my argument would be that networks probably played a greater role in the trajectory of radical Reformation groups because of their lack of hierarchical sponsorship and their vulnerability to persecution. For example, Martin Rothkegel has made a compelling case that the Anabaptist Austerlitz Brethren, as early as 1528, constructed a network of spiritually united congregations that acted as a clandestine international communion from Moravia in the east to Alsace in the west, so almost underground networks of religious communities. The node in this important story is the Holy Church of Austerlitz in Moravia, which became the center of an Anabaptist denominational network called the Fellows of the Covenant under the leadership of Pilgrim Marbeck. Neither operating as an ecclesiastical hierarchy, as in the Roman Church, nor a municipal or territorial-based religious entity, as in the Lutheran and Reformed Reformations, the Austerlitz pioneered a new form of a networked ecclesiastical structure, what has been called a denominational network, that was later paralleled by the rise of the Mennonites in the Netherlands and in the Low German territories, and from the 17th century onward by the British Baptist associations and the system of supra-local meetings of the Quakers. In short, this nascent denominational structure started as a survival and unifying network of radical persecuted Protestants and became one of the most influential organizing tropes in all the history of Christendom. According to Rothkegel, Marpeck and the network of Anabaptists he laid played an important role in shaping an ecclesiological model based on voluntarism, which in subsequent centuries would make Christianity compatible with a modern pluralistic society. It's a really important point, actually, that the survival of Christianity in Europe outside the purview of established churches, whether Catholic, Protestant, or Reformed, or Lutheran, was largely dependent on this undercurrent of networks that were established during the Radical Reformation and beyond. And it really does underpin, I think, bigger stories about the American colonies, the American Revolution, the separation of church and state, and many big issues that have flowed out from that. So the roots of these things are important, and to figure out where they came from. So this analysis of Protestant Reformation networks, Lutheran, Reformed, and Radical, stops short of the beginnings of the powerful networks of correspondence, print, and organizational innovations built by the Pietists, when improved literacy rates and female education added yet new dimensions. It's an important part of the story in the 17th century. As literacy rates improve, female education develops more strongly. Potentially the largest and most radical network idea of all coming out of the Protestant Reformations was the deeply subversive doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. This is a network of Christian believers. Nothing struck so deeply at the heart of the whole structure of the medieval Catholic Church and its successors than the notion of a general priesthood. But as Reg Ward has pointed out, it did not receive a full-scale treatment until Jakob Spener at the end of the 17th century. And the general history of Protestantism since then has been virtually a conscious evasion of this doctrine of the priesthood of all believers in favor of clerical establishments of one kind or another right across the religious traditions. At the same time as the Lutheran Reformation was roiling the Holy Roman Empire and John Calvin was producing his Institutes of the Christian Religion, one of the world's most powerful and enduring religious networks was arising within the very Catholic Church that the Reformers were attacking. I think it's important to point out that, so I'm going to move on to talk about the Society of Jesus, that although this arose at the same time as the Protestant Reformations, I think its roots go more deeply into medieval Catholicism than a direct response to the Reformations themselves. The Society of Jesus, founded by Ignatius of Loyola, arose out of a gathering of university students at the University of Paris in the 1530s and was given formal approval by Pope Paul III in 1540. It later emerged as the largest mission organization in the world. Although comprised only of men, Jesuits were also spiritual directors of women and sometimes used women associates as catechists. Recent scholarship has paid attention to their immense investment in colleges and their cultural contributions to education, theatre, music, architecture, agriculture, industry, map drawing, mathematics. They expertly raised money, built libraries, educated Europe's Catholic elites, promoted civic engagement, pioneered scientific inquiry, constructed maps, employed the visual arts, and produced any number of grammars, vocabularies, catechisms, and confession manuals. Hence, they were not only enthusiastic missionaries, but also inexhaustible cultural dynamos. Although much depended on whether Jesuits entered foreign missions on the coattails of conquering armies or as missionaries to non-subjugated civilizations, as in China, this is black robes versus Mandarin robes, they built a reputation for engaging foreign cultures, not as domineering imperialists, but as skillful adapters to local sensibilities. But Jesuits also underwent a rigorous program of spiritual formation based on their founders' spiritual exercises, which helps explain not only their personal discipline, but also their enthusiasm for global mission. In the parlance of this lecture series, the Ignatian spiritual exercises is where the nucleus of the Jesuit enterprise was located. And its increasingly global networks consisted of people circulating letters in print, and most visibly of all, colleges. They created what one historian has called the biggest network of private schools Europe has known, with something in the order of 500 to 600 distributed across the continent. My intention is to understand better how the spiritual exercises acted as the energy center of the Jesuit enterprise, then to look at the extensive network of the Jesuit educational system, especially how it was funded, and then to look at how the Jesuit networks fared during the suppression of the order at the end of the 18th century, What happens to networks when they get crushed? Put simply, we will examine the Jesuit nucleus, follow the money that built the network, and compare the virtual society of the suppressed Jesuit order with what came before and after. Beginning with the nucleus, I want to examine further a connection Michel Molina has made between the history of Western subjectivity and the history of early modern global expansion, or less technically, how individual efforts at spiritual transformation had global significance. In particular, Molina explores how new thinking about self and world were key components of Jesuit evangelical efforts, and how Jesuit spirituality proceeded from self-reform to the reform of the whole world. Central to our investigation is the comment by Arnold Davison that, quote, "In trying to capture the different forms in which the care of the self has appeared, it is essential to understand not only the ways in which the self became an object of concern, but also how one went beyond oneself, relating the self to something grander than oneself." With that in mind, Molina shows how the enormously influential Ignatian spiritual exercises were designed to reform oneself internally in the service of a greater cause, namely the conversion of the world's population. Beginning with introspective exercises of prayerful divine engagement and self-scrutiny, practitioners were encouraged to look outward to imagine the whole world. Originally conceived as a month-long exercise in spiritual formation, the first week, not necessarily 7 days, was devoted to spiritual exercises to overcome oneself and to order one's life. The second week was devoted to the contemplation of the kingdom of Jesus Christ, the call of the temporal king as an aid towards contemplating the life of the eternal king. In these exercises, the practitioner was encouraged to imagine the life of Jesus as he moved through synagogues and villages, preaching the kingdom, and then to follow him. The practitioner was to ask for, quote, "an interior knowledge of our Lord, who became human for me, that I may love him more intensely and follow him more closely." Following meant bringing together the interior knowledge of Christ with an expansive vision of the redemption of the whole world. The practitioner was urged, quote, "to see the great extent of the circuit of the world with people so many and so diverse. I will see the various persons, some here, some there. First those on the face of the earth, so diverse in dress and behavior, some white and others black, some in peace, others at war, some weeping and others laughing, some healthy and others sick, some being born and others dying. I will listen to what the persons on the face of the earth are saying. That is how they speak with one another, swear and blaspheme, and so on. Likewise, I will hear what the divine persons are saying. That is, let us work for the redemption of the human race." The third and fourth weeks were centered on Christ's passion and death and the resurrection appearances. Taken together, the four-part exercises were a way and a means to bringing the divine into closer relation with sinful people and to prayerfully imagine a deeper discipleship. Originally conceived as a 30-day retreat, the Jesuits adapted and abridged the exercises in various programs to suit the individual needs of the laity. What was new about this in the early modern period was not so much the religious content of the exercises, which are well known to have had medieval precedents, but the audience. The laity was being monasticized. A combination of shortened exercises to be completed in only 8 days or less, and the growth of retreat houses where the exercises could be directed, expanded the range of Jesuit spirituality to a much larger group of people, both religious and lay. Moreover, these disciplines occurred within the context of European imperial expansion and the growing circulation of the Jesuit relations. These were missionary reports about what was happening in different parts of the world. I mentioned Marie of the Incarnation last night, who got her calling to go to what is now Canada and found an Ursuline monastery there, came from reading the Jesuit relations. These missionary reports were extremely influential. In short, self-discipline and spiritual formation, a key component of which was a desire to see the rule of Christ over all nations, was a way of universalizing the Christian message, and personal submission was a prelude to missionary action. Put another way, using early modern language, In Jesuit spirituality, the religion of the heart was an expression of love for the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and the Sacred Heart of Jesus was in turn capable of embracing the whole world. In this way, the Jesuit nucleus, the Ignatian spiritual exercises, was a powerful tool of missionary spirituality that enabled individual practitioners to maintain self-discipline and focus, even when they were deprived of a supportive community and familiar surroundings. This allowed missionaries to mission. The spiritual and intellectual preparation of the Jesuits made them ready to travel across cultures and capable of working alone, even in hostile circumstances. There would have been no Jesuit missionary network without Jesuit spiritual formation. Now, the exercises were essential to how the Jesuit order took shape, but they were also supplemented by the formula of the Institute, which was the short form early rule of the order, and by the meticulously crafted constitutions, which reflected the extraordinary organizational talents of Ignatius, who turned the original charism and zeal of the exercises into a well-organized global network. These constitutions are extremely important. It marks out the Jesuit order from previous Catholic orders in the 13th, 14th century, and gave it a greater degree of network solidarity. It was a binding mechanism. Within a generation, this network extended through virtually every country in Western Europe and had reached Brazil, India, Japan, and soon China. And Ignatius himself traveled along the European routes of the network and even got himself to Palestine. Somewhat unique to the Jesuits by comparison with other Catholic orders was their practice of mixing nationalities in any given mission, making the Jesuits international in a way the other orders were not. Italian Jesuits could be sent to Portuguese or Spanish colonial outposts, and so on and so on. One tension at the heart of the Jesuit enterprise directly parallels that between networks and hierarchies more generally. And this is a question that was raised last night. How do you think about networks relating to hierarchies? And this case, I think, is an interesting one. That is, how could the networks of individual spiritual formation coexist with the ecclesiastically sanctioned prescriptions and proscriptions of the Catholic Church? Put another way, the Jesuit tradition lives with the tension between a missionary commitment to life at the Church's boundaries and an allegiance to the visible hierarchical institution itself. This tension could be, and often was, a point of friction in the centuries ahead, but it was also a source of energy as the spiritual exercises became the foundation of the Jesuit order's remarkable expansion to over 1,000 members before Ignatius' death in 1556. If the exercises supplied a flexible discipline and relational spirituality for its devotees, the ubiquitous network of colleges extended the order's social and cultural influence in quite remarkable ways. But influence did not come cheap. In explaining how the Jesuits raised the money for their network of colleges without charging tuition, a subject dear to the heart of any university administrator, Alwyn Houghton draws an analogy with modern fundraising by universities, which raise money by cultivating elite and wealthy donors, borrowing and lending money, initiating building campaigns, and appealing equally to civic virtue and self-interest in attracting gifts and graduating talented students. Jesuits relied on a complex amalgam of funding from popes and bishops to civic dignitaries and wealthy widows. But as with fundraising for universities, the income stream was never guaranteed, and there was never quite enough income to keep debt at bay. All university administrators will tell you that. Jesuits soon discovered, as with university capital campaigns, that raising money for buildings was easier than paying for their upkeep. And although they mined every possible source of income, the default position for most of the pre-revolutionary Jesuit colleges was one of hand-to-mouth indebtedness. Houghton's conclusion is that the whole Jesuit financial edifice, not unlike that of the rickety Ancien Regime financial system itself, within which it was located, was by the end of the 18th century under the same kinds of stresses and strains that stoked the wider revolutionary energies throughout the Atlantic world, and made a major contribution to the French Revolution. Debt or no debt, the Jesuit colleges from the first foundation in Messina in 1548 through the opening of the influential Roman College in 1551 was to the 120 plus colleges in Italy alone on the eve of the suppression of the society in 1773 was truly a remarkable educational achievement that contributed to the education of tens of thousands of students who in turn built their own networks of influence throughout Europe and beyond. This is a little slide of Jesuit schools and universities in Western Europe in those years. It's a huge achievement, actually. The financing and management of the network of Jesuit colleges required an immense amount of paperwork and bookkeeping, and the coordination of the studies in the Ignatian spirit demanded adherence to a common curriculum supplied by the Ratio Studiorum, written in 1598 and issued a year later. It's an important other part of the Jesuit schooling network was a common curriculum, which I know many universities have experimented with over the years. Moreover, the educational experiences of both boys and men equipped them for purposeful civic leadership in which piety and intellectual cultivation were designed to produce a sanctified society and a Christian civilization. The Jesuit schools and colleges also required and sustained an enormous intellectual and material investment in printed books throughout the whole spectrum of the Studia Humanitatis. The extent to which the Jesuits became cultural dynamos is illustrated literally by the publication and distribution of so-called emblem books, in which spiritual and ethical truths were made memorable by pictures, maxims, and poems. According to O'Malley, the Jesuits produced more emblem books than any other group, publishing some 1,700 of them in the first half of the 17th century alone. Ironically, the Jesuits exploited the new world of movable type and book illustrations more assiduously than any other group since the early Lutheran reformers. If the nucleus of the Jesuit enterprise was the spiritual exercises and the networks were primarily the colleges and their curricula, the two were brought together in the confraternities and sodalities organized for the college students. The confraternities had three primary characteristics. They inculcated Ignatian piety, they helped mobilize the laity in support of Jesuit missions and charity, and they drew members from all social classes. They also extended the reach of Jesuit networks into local communities through charitable activities, catechizing, communion preparation, and fostering new vocations. The most important node of the Jesuit enterprise was Rome. It was there that Ignatius built the Jesuit organization and located the superior general of the order. Rome was also the location of the great foundational churches and the most important colleges, including the Roman College, later renamed the Gregorian University. And many European colleges, including the German and English colleges, in which became sending institutions for the work of the order throughout the continent and beyond. As Jesuit networks expanded geographically, they were knit together by a formidable epistolary network that sustained horizontal as well as vertical bonds within the order and diminished the spatial separation and loneliness of missionaries dispersed throughout the world. The constant exchange of letters was at once an administrative discipline, a connecting mechanism, and a religious practice in its own right. As beneficiaries of the imperial expansion of Western Europe in the early modern period, the sheer extent of the Jesuit reach into the non-European world is hard to overestimate. From New France and Latin America in the West to India, China, and Japan in the East, Jesuit missionaries encountered native peoples and ancient civilizations and relentlessly communicated on their encounters. They built churches, missions, colleges, disseminated and imbibed new knowledge, and were often sensitive intermediaries between European and non-European cultures and civilizations. But controversy and conflict were rarely far from the surface. From the Guarini reductions in Latin America, memorialized in the famous film The Mission with Jeremy Irons, I don't know how many of you have seen it. From the Guarini reductions in Latin America to the Chinese rights controversy in China, and from the Malabar rights controversy in India to Tokugawa persecutions in Japan, the Jesuits often found themselves at the center of irreconcilable conflicts between Christianity and other religious and civic traditions, and even within Catholic Christianity itself, as 18th century popes sought to impose stricter standards of confessional orthodoxy on the outer edges of the Jesuit networks. As the early modern papacy sought to impose more organizational and doctrinal control over an increasingly geographically diffuse church, Roman networks and Jesuit networks were sometimes at loggerheads with one another. Throughout the history of the Jesuits, controversy and conflict had repeatedly resulted in proscriptions and expulsions. But by the second half of the 18th century, a more ominous storm tide was gathering against them. Once the heralds of the Counter-Reformation, by the mid-18th century, the Jesuit Order had seemed to become far too powerful for its own good. From the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay to the bankruptcy of the Jesuit missions in the French West Indies, from the reforming energies of the enlightened administrators in Portugal and Spain to a series of legal feuds in the Paris Parlement, the Jesuits seemed to be on the receiving end of remorselessly bad news, all the more because it could neither be contained within a single country nor confined to a single cause. Beginning in Portugal with the expulsion of the Jesuits from the metropolitan mainland and the Asian and South American colonies in 1759, the dominoes of the demise of the Jesuit order tumbled with inexorable rapidity. In 1764, the society was dissolved in France. In 1767, following the famous hat and cloak riots of a year earlier, Charles III of Spain followed the Portuguese model by expelling the Jesuits from Spain and its colonies. Naples and Parma followed suit the same year. And in 1773, the most crushing blow of all came when Clement XIV, under irresistible pressure from the Bourbon powers, formally dissolved the society with a papal bull. The papal dissolution naturally spelt the end of the Jesuits among the Catholic German states, within the domains of the Austrian Habsburgs, and in missions everywhere. Now, it's tempting to attribute all this hostility to a primary cause, such as the impact of the Enlightenment or the influence of the Jansenists, or to what Jonathan Wright has called a shared repertoire of supposed Jesuit abuse, ranging from regicide to sexual perversion and to avaricious profiteering. But in truth, the suppression seems to have been a combination of generic international unpopularity and discrete political events from country to country. Whereas in previous suppressions, Rome was generally a protected haven for the Jesuits, in 1773 they lost their spatial node. But what happened then to the network so energetically constructed over 2 centuries? Although we still lack an authoritative treatment of the Jesuits during the suppression from 1773 to the reconstitution in 1814, the outlines of the story are pretty clear. There's no denying that the suppression dealt a serious blow to the entire Jesuit enterprise. 23,000 Jesuits were thrust into potentially vulnerable positions. Most of their properties were seized and their missions abandoned. Their educational functions were passed on to other religious orders, and the Society's Superior General, Lorenzi Ricci, was incarcerated in Rome and was never released. There were, of course, episodic stories of stoic endurance in many countries such as Austria and Poland, but the 2 most notable sites of Jesuit survival were, ironically, the Russian Empire and the United States. Under Catherine the Great's protection, the Jesuits in modern-day Belarus benefited from their scientific and educational prominence and thrived under less public and more private support from the papacy. In this one part of the world, the old Jesuit node in Rome and its epistolary and educational networks allowed the Jesuits to resume almost business as usual with a vicar general, a workable hierarchy, and an educational network of colleges. Under the unlikely protection of successive Russian czars and permission from the papacy, the Jesuits not only constructed a formal system of governance in the Russian Empire, but also conferred affiliate status on Jesuits from many different European countries. Effectively, the Jesuits had a new and unexpected node, Russia, but it did not last. Ironically, the formal restoration of this society in 1814 was quickly followed by its expulsion from major Russian cities in 1815 and eventually from the Russian Empire in 1820. An autocrat's whim could save the Jesuits, but it also could destroy them, is how one historian has described it. A different pattern of survival emerged in the United States under the influence of John Carroll, Bishop of Maryland, and an erstwhile Jesuit. American Jesuits benefited from an influx of Jesuits from the Russian provinces and from the emergence of Georgetown as the intellectual center of American Catholicism. In the United States, the corporate structure of the Jesuit Order was virtually demolished, but its network connections thrived in different forms. Outside Russia and the United States, Jesuits both suffered from suppression and benefited from the opening up of other cultural opportunities, where they played an active part in the centers of 18th century enlightened sociality. Jesuits became important in academies, libraries, publishing houses, astronomical laboratories, scientific laboratories, Masonic lodges. They were still the educated elite. During the 4 decades of suppression, the Jesuits were never eradicated by force, and they were able to maintain a skeleton of both formal institutions and informal networks. This served them well when Pope Pius VII restored the Society of Jesus with the promulgation of a papal bull in 1814. There were about 600 only remaining Jesuits when the society was restored, but by 1820 they were back up to 1,300, 4,600 in 1850, 15,000 by 1900, when they returned to almost all their former territories and were reaching out to new missions. Whatever the bare numbers say, however, the Jesuit order that was restored in 1814 was not the one that was suppressed in 1773. And the world order in which religious institutions had to operate had been seismically changed by the American and French revolutions. What the decades of suppression showed is that even without the support of political and ecclesiastical elites, and often their active hostility, the Jesuits were able to survive and in some places thrive by holding fast to their old nucleus, the spiritual exercises, to their educational philosophy, to their habits of mind, and to their formal and informal networks. They also kept meticulous archives, which allowed them to tell their own story and allowed the rest of us to appreciate its importance ever since. In conclusion, then, what these studies of 2 Reformation-era networks show is that in the 16th century, religious ideas intersected with other macroscopic changes in print and culture, in commerce and social structure, in education and civic engagement, and early modern globalization to produce changes of truly epochal importance. These changes do not easily yield their causes and consequences to analyses of singular religious traditions in a particular nation state or a particular geographical region. Connecting the networks, identifying the nodes, dissecting the nuclei, at least allows for a wider range of analytical possibilities and helps guard against the Catholic and Protestant propagandized versions of religious history in the Reformation era. So this last point is something I believe fairly strongly, that the kind of analysis that we're looking at in these lectures not only opens up, I think, the connections with the 4 or 5 things I mentioned in the conclusion, but I think guards against what often shines out in religious histories, and that is a kind of almost neo-propagandized version of the past, serving the institutions that create the historical narratives, or serving the nation states within which they're located. So this alternative way of looking at Christian transmission in history not only helps you see things otherwise you might not see, but I think is a protection against the kind of propaganda that I mentioned just then. Thanks very much for your patience with that. I appreciate it. Ferguson.
You go there and over here. Well, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful, erudite, brilliant lecture, and nodes and nuclei, and just the whole metaphor of that seems to me to be a wonderful lens through which to track through history in the way that you've done. So thank you so much for that. Very, very enlightening in a building that was very much at the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment. This is very much an Enlightenment evening, so thank you very much. We've got time for some questions now. There's a roving microphone, which Mark Newen has. And if you'd like to ask a question, you could put your hand up and then wait for the roving microphone. And we've got a lot of questions. So if we begin there and then move towards the back. I'm going to try and sit down. The lights are a little bit difficult to see people with hands up. I'm going to try and sit. So we have our first question, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was tremendously exciting. I'm a lay Dominican, so obviously I regard the Jesuits with both great respect and great skepticism. But I think you said early on something that I would want to encourage you to sort of expand on, not necessarily now, but in the book version, which is the relationship of the Jesuits to the orders that went before, and particularly the Dominicans, because on one hand, a lot of the things that you said were characteristic of the Jesuits were already characteristic of the Dominicans and Franciscans and the other friars in the 13th century, particularly the confraternities, and obviously that's crucial. But I think that one difference between the Dominicans and the Jesuits, but which would also shed very important light on the networks of the Jesuits, is the groups of women who followed the same spirituality. Now that's much easier to see in the case of the Dominicans because obviously they're called Dominican, they wear Dominican habits, and they're more closely integrated into the Dominican order. But then you do get these congregations that come out that have their own constitutions from the 19th century. Now if you do that same kind of thing with the Jesuits, so you look at both the sort of lay confraternity groups around them, but also specifically the women's congregations and groups that are following what they would call Ignatian spirituality. I think you'll instantly see something you can see from the Dominicans, for example, which is if you look at the number of Dominicans there are in the world, there are 20 times as many women vowed to the same life. And I think you would find it would probably be even more true of the Jesuits, if you look at the number of Ignatian women. Right. And therefore, when you look at the networks, it's just like the early history of the brain, that they suddenly discovered that actually there are all these that the white matter is much more important than the grey matter, and there's much more of it. And in the same kind of way, there are far more women around who are just kind of invisible, but when you start looking for them, you'll see that they're sort of crucial to the whole operation.
You can see how this theoretical model of networks, nodes, and nuclei, that the more you figure things out around the kind of question you've posed, the deeper you get into the kinds of networks that just don't show up very obviously in most historical accounts. And this is, I think, what I'm driving at the lecture series. In a way, I take your comment as an encouragement to try and figure that out more deeply, because in a way I got, intrigued by the differences between the Jesuit order and the earlier ones, and having to pick a start date for the lecture series, 1500 seemed easier than 1200 or 1300. But thank you for the comment. I think it's a great one.
So we've got two questions now, one there, and then I think a further one at the back there on the left-hand side as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was just curious, within your definition of network, if you would consider pilgrimage routes, like the Santiago de Compostela, to be a network, or if that's something different within your methodology.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll be, speaking, a bit more about that tomorrow, about the pilgrimage networks within the Iberian empires and New Spain and so on. I guess if I've kind of majored on the excitement of this, alliterative trifecta, but one of the potential weaknesses of it is just knowing when to stop. When does everything become a network of a certain kind? So on pilgrimages, for example, I do think, in the book I mentioned yesterday on international religious networks, it was a Studies in Church History conference. Pilgrimages were in that as a part of a classic network, especially of an earlier period. So I think yes is the answer, but I say it with a little bit of unease because it kind of just keeps spilling over into more and more categories that get me into trouble eventually.
Thank you. And there.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. Interesting. I was born in Belfast, so it's interesting to hear what you were saying about propaganda among Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah.
I'm here this evening. I studied theology as an undergraduate. I now work on websites, and I found it very interesting this evening, kind of combining two areas in my head, which are sort of real passion areas. I think one thing that struck me with my digital marketing head on is the kind of transactional nature of these networks. And that is sort of, you rub my back, I'll rub yours. And it just really struck me how, what was the driving force for people adopting these networks and adopting the various things that, through Luther and Calvinism and then with the Jesuits, because I think there's always has to be a reason why people want to interact and engage. I was wondering whether it's things like community, belonging, whether it's also, as you were saying, with the printing press, but it's just something that I just noticed upon. Because we're always looking at what are our users' needs, what do they want from us in order for them to then engage with us.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I guess what I was trying to get at in the kind of nucleus idea, as I was thinking about how to configure these lectures, I got really interested in trying to figure out what was the heart and center of these networks that allowed them to gain energy and succeed. And I guess it's a little bit of a dangerous historical way of thinking, because I'm privileging successful networks and not speaking much about failed networks. So in all of the things I've spoken about this evening, I've tried to get to the heart and center of something that was a powerful generative idea. So not just a transaction, something that was that deeper than just transactional, something that carried risk as well as opportunity, something that was deeply held, and allowed networks to, because the print networks were nothing without the content of the print, right? It wasn't just the fact that there were a bunch of printing presses in imperial towns. When the Catholic Church tried to respond with its own refutation publications in Leipzig, where they still controlled the printing presses, printers couldn't give the works away virtually. It was just really unsuccessful. So there are moments, I think, when these ideas strike much deeper roots, and that's a big, deep historical question of why. Why did these ideas gain such currency in the 1510 to 20 period, when some of them had been around for quite a long time before that. And those are complicated questions. But that's why I think that, I do think this method of trying to get at the heart of something, what is the nucleus, what is the atomic structure of this that's giving some energy to it, almost like nuclear fusion of some kind. And where are the places of intersection where they then gain currency? And what kind of networks are they, and what sustain them is really what is driving it.
Thank you. Mark, could you come down here? I've got a question down at the front, and then we might just take a couple more at the back, and then I think we will be sadly running out of time. And then Alvin too.
I already had several questions, but I'm going to just pick one. It's a comment probably, which is about the tension between different discourses that you're just talking about. And I found so interesting the map that you showed of the schools in France, because the schools in Europe, the Jesuit schools in Europe, are mostly concentrated in France. Like in France, as far as I know, is a very very tensional territory at the moment in between the the Catholic and the Protestant world. So I was actually thinking if the true heart of the Jesuits was France and not Rome, and but of course it is in Rome that the information is gathered from across the world. So I don't know, but I found it very interesting, that tension between France and Italy in that period.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you. I mean, I just don't know enough to answer the question really well, to be honest with you. But I mean, certainly there was a very fast expansion of the Jesuit schools in Italy as well. But you're right, the map does show a really large concentration in France. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to know more.
Running out of time, so can I ask? There's one question there, and then there's a couple. Can we do quite a gathered field of questions, Alvin, and then going back to Jay at the back? Are you happy to give way?
Yeah, maybe two more.
That's fine.
Well, thank you for another tremendous lecture. I've been trying to think a little bit further about what is not a network, a religious network. What's in opposition to the study of the networks that you've been doing? And I've also been trying to think a little bit about your starting point, 1500s to the 16th century. And I was just wondering, to what extent is the opposition to your story of networks, voluntary associations, the rise of the nation state, which is also occurring, from 1500s onwards, which has a settled population. It's not a population that's to be moving. We get the development of national churches, parishes in which people are born, and which, many, the ideal is that they will remain their entire lives. And their ancestors buried in the parish churchyard. So I was just wondering, to what extent is the opposition to your story of religious networks, the rise of the nation state, and the rise of national churches and national religion?
That's a great question, Jay, and both parts of it are great. What is not a network in my story? And I guess what I'm really trying to do with these lectures is think of networks as almost flow charts, things that are moving across conventional boundaries. So what is not a network might be then the conventional boundaries, including the hierarchically organized churches, or as you say, the emergence of nation states at the same time. So, central to my purpose, I think, is it's almost like a curious travelogue in a way, and I'm trying to figure out the movement, because I think that's what has been less well treated historically. Even the emergence of nation states is quite well written about in a way, and there's lots of controversy over how and why, but there's a lot of interest in it. Whereas I do find that, thinking more about the flows across, and the other point you made about the notion that in these Christendom churches where ecclesiastical parishes are where people are born and die and get buried and so on. So in a sense, my networks are ones that are privileging people who are moving around, or at least privileging connections between local communities that are serviced by people moving around, even if the communities themselves are not moving around. And the other thing that I'm struggling with a little bit is, to be honest, is the extent to which my nuclei are consistent. Is the nucleus consistent? Is this the coronavirus wherever it shows up? Or are there variants of this virus that are still recognizably coronavirus but adapt to different locales, whether India or South America or whatever? And I think I'm thinking more in those ways, that although there may be these nucleus ideas that are big, powerful ideas, that the way they relate in local communities may be somewhat different, and that there may be a variant strain, may still be within the broad umbrella of this Protestant virus, but may actually have very different local characteristics. But it's a great, it's a well-framed question. Thank you. So maybe one more, Victoria. You've been waiting patiently here, I think, yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question,
One more,
and then I think we'll have to, I'm afraid we'll have to close then. So just one more there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lecture, Professor Hempton. Actually, your comment about the Jesuits keeping their own really good archives sparked something off from my own research, which one of my case studies is the Iona community, and they haven't done that. And it got me thinking about how far through their history, the different nodes that they've encountered have kind of changed their mission so much that I'm questioning whether their nuclei is consistent. And so in that sense, I'm wondering, is that continuation of the network important? And it kind of blends into your response to Professor Brown's question, but at what sense does it become networks rather than one network?
Within the Jesuit or more generally?
Just generally, like more using the methodology, like how much change are we going to allow before we change network from networks? And does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it does make sense. And again, I might go back to this, virology analogy. The extent to which are these surges in viral transmission new phenomena, or are they part of the same kind of, how will historians write the history of this epidemic as a singular thing, or as a set of fast-moving and fast-changing in different host cultures and different places at different times. So that's, I think, always going to be a judgment call. What I tried to do in the Jesuit case, I think, was to try and show that the spiritual exercises, but not just the spiritual exercises, the curriculum, the formula, the constitutions. I mean, what I think marks out the Jesuits from the Dominicans and others that were referred to by a previous questioner was the extent to which not just Ignatius of Loyola, but his assistants, his hand-picked secretaries and organizational apparatchiks really constructed something that is a network. It has a formula. It's got a set of constitutions. It's got an educational philosophy and curriculum. It's got a game plan for mission and relating the story of mission. So I think in the examples I'm choosing, I'm trying not to let the network fly away in multiple different directions. So that's why I handpick a little bit the networks that seem to me to be defensible as classic networks, even though I'm prepared to admit, there's no question that the Jesuits who get reestablished after 1814 are not the Jesuit order that was in existence in the early 18th century. Just not. Multiple things had changed. So is it the same thing? Well, in some respects, yes. In many respects, no. So I think that, I know I have to build in the flexibility of change over time, like all historians have to cope with the very good question you asked. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you very much. It's always a sign of a great lecture when there are too many questions and not enough time to answer them all. But this is not going to be the only opportunity to engage in conversation and debate about the Gifford lectures. I've got a number of announcements here that I just want to go through. That, of course, the next lecture in the series is on Thursday when you're at 5:30 in here. And we're going to look forward to the next lecture entitled Religious Networks in the Age of Empire in the New Spain and West Africa, so continuing on the journey. We're also holding an online discussion throughout the fortnight of the series of Gifford lectures on our Gifford Lectures blog, which is Victoria Turner of New College. Yes, that's yes, Victoria. And you can contribute to the conversation and discussion there. You can access the blog via the Gifford Lectures web pages. They're obviously the critical piece of information. You're also very warmly invited to attend the Gifford Seminar, which is held on Wednesday next week, on the 13th of October, from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, and it's going to be an online event through Microsoft Teams. And anyone who wants to attend that will need to sign up for that. And again, the details are on the Gifford Lecture website. And at that event, Professor Hempton will be joined by Susan Harden-Moore, who is the Professor of Early Modern Religion, and Professor Brian Stanley, Professor in World Christianity, both of New College in Edinburgh, to discuss questions from the audience arising from the series as a whole, but it's obviously provoked a lot of discussion and debate. So all it remains for me is to thank the organisers of the event, to thank you, the audience, for coming along and engaging in discussion, and then finally to thank David again for his brilliant lecture. Thoroughly enjoyable, and it's been a great evening, so thank you very much indeed. Thank you.